It's still based on Islam. And if you do not go after the doctrine on the basis of Al-Qaeda, Islamic law, as they understand it, then you cannot understand Al-Qaeda.
Basically, in order to try to avoid hurting radical Islamist feelings, we have engaged in callous and reckless disregard for the welfare of American citizens.
Congressman Louis Gohmert of Texas sits on the House Judiciary Committee, where he serves as the vice chairman of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security.
And we cannot be foolish about the way we go about protecting America.
Gohmert has made several attempts to convince Congress that political correctness is cleansing the nation's terrorism lexicon.
And the 9/11 Commission report used words like enemy 39 times, jihad 126 times, Muslim 145 times, because those who wanted to destroy us and tried used that term about themselves.
The 9/11 Commission report was released in 2004. 5 years later, the FBI's Counterterrorism Lexicon Guide contained absolutely no references to terms like Islam, Muslim, and jihad. But it does mention violent extremism 29 times in 11 pages.
How on earth do you understand the suicide bomber who thinks he's going to go to heaven and get 72 virgins if you're not allowed to talk about the religious justification for his violence and the ideology of jihad? There's no way you can understand the enemy.
But for distinguished military and law enforcement trainers like Gorka and Coughlin, their frustrations were just starting to mount.
Wired magazine, a man named Ackerman picked up the charge. It was, for that whole rest of the year, everywhere I went, there was a Wired story following it.
Beginning in July 2011, Wired magazine published a series of articles that intensified the debate. On one side, there was political correctness, and on the other was effective law enforcement training. The articles were written by Spencer Ackerman, a man known for his ties to the Journalist, a private online forum used by liberal members of the media to promote a left-leaning narrative.
It's very deeply upsetting to counterterrorism experts inside the FBI. They're very concerned about two related issues, which are counterterrorism and civil rights. And those two go hand in hand because, as you remember, the great Jimmy McNulty said on The Wire, a cop isn't anything without his sources of information.
And that's the entire initiative with the Islamophobia campaign, which is to stop all discussion about Islam by anybody not authorized to speak on its behalf.
On October 19th, 2011, then Deputy National Security Advisor John Brennan received a letter at the White House signed by more than 50 Muslim American groups demanding action on the allegedly offensive training materials. Several of the groups who signed the letter, including the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, and the Islamic Society of North America, or ISNA, were identified as Muslim Brotherhood affiliates just 3 years earlier during the Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terrorism financing trial in U.S. history. CAIR and ISNA were named as unindicted co-conspirators in the case.
And then I saw the letter that went to the White House from groups that are heavily represented by the Muslim Brotherhood, followed 10 days later by a response. And I kind of thought, wow, it was all based on an article from Ackerman. There were like 14 different or 15 different footnotes, and 13 of them were for one Ackerman article.
Very, very soon after we heard that something had changed at the highest levels of the U.S. government, I had to go back to an FBI facility to give my standard Al-Qaeda lecture, and then suddenly the FBI said, well, we need all your slide deck in advance, and we have to send it off somewhere to get it approved. And that's when I first heard about it. And then a week or two later, an anonymized email gets forwarded to me by the FBI, in which somebody somewhere took offense to various of my slides, called them inflammatory, and basically said either these are removed or you don't get to brief in front of federal law enforcement. And the really strange thing was, not only was I not allowed to appeal or discuss with this faceless person what the issues were, not even the FBI could identify who this individual was, who I later found out was somebody inside the civil rights section of DOJ at the highest levels.
We are reviewing all of the materials, all of our training materials, to ensure that that kind of misinformation is not being used, because that can really undermine the really substantial outreach efforts that we have made, and really have a negative impact on our ability to communicate effectively, as we have in the past, with this community. I almost hesitate to say this community, because the reality is, when you say Muslim Americans, we're talking about Americans.
Of course, if you step back the clock a little bit, you'll recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood demanded a purge in that letter to Brennan that you had at the White House, that the White House conformed to. They said they're going to do that. And I remember every time I asked, you'd get those little conversations or sidebar discussions, and they all said, Steve, we'd like to do something about this, but let's go to the White House. So I knew I was done.
While Coughlin and Gorka struggled to get answers, the Islamic groups calling for the purge had little trouble communicating their demands to senior leadership in the U.S. government. On February 8, 2012, then FBI Director Robert Mueller met with representatives from 6 Islamic organizations, including ISNA, to discuss the results of the purge. Eventually, lawmakers learned that the Bureau removed 876 documents and nearly 400 presentations from its training programs, based on the recommendations from 5 so-called subject matter experts.
We would like to know who these subject matter experts are that are going through the FBI material and purging that of reference to jihad and Islam and these type of things.
When lawmakers demanded more information on the purging of training materials, officials at the FBI and the Department of Defense quickly classified much of the information, including the identities of the subject matter experts.
There was no reason to classify the names of the subject matter experts who went through and purged the material. I think those things were classified more out of a concern, out of being embarrassed by who they were, rather than out of protecting the American public. This is all about political correctness.
So you're in a situation where you have our government classifying people who are playing a role in our understanding of the nature of the enemy in the war on terror against the American people. It's classified from our understanding. And I think that's because they know that these people can't stand up to scrutiny.
On March 23, 2012, a senior FBI official met with staff members from the House Judiciary Committee to address their concerns regarding the purge. For the Record has obtained a transcript of that meeting, and at one point, a congressional staff member openly questioned the government's track record in selecting Islamic advisors. The individual asked the FBI agent, quote, "How do we know these subject matter experts are good guys?" The FBI official responded, "I guess ultimately, I don't."
The parallel I always give is, imagine if during World War II it would have been illegal to use the word Nazi in the US government. Imagine during the civil rights campaigns during the 40s and 50s when the FBI was trying to hunt down and close down the Ku Klux Klan and those people that were lynching black-skinned Americans. Imagine if anybody in the US government had said, you are not allowed to call these individuals bigots, racists, or white supremacists. That individual would have been excoriated, would have been kicked out of office before they could have blinked. It is so unethical, so un-American that, of course, they have to protect themselves somehow through the cloak of anonymity.
Welcome back. In 2011 and 2012, the counterterrorism materials used to train federal law enforcement and the military were dramatically altered. Muslim American groups, several of which are inextricably linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, demanded a purge of documents they called offensive. But until last year, most of the content deemed offensive was concealed from the American people. Several groups have sued the government under the Freedom of Information Act to find out exactly what was removed. What they found said a lot about America's vulnerability and the cost of political correctness.
There's a group of terrorist front groups here in the United States that are treated by some in the media as legitimate civil rights organizations on behalf of Muslims or Islamists, when in fact they're nothing but fronts for foreign terrorist organizations.
Tom Fitton is the president of Judicial Watch, a group that has used the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, to expose how the purge has severely restricted law enforcement and the Defense Department's understanding of the nation's enemies.
It began in the Bush administration, frankly, and it grew worse under the Obama administration, and now we can't use the word jihadist or Islamist or talk about the religious roots of Al-Qaeda terrorism and Islamic terrorism in our national intelligence establishment.
In June 2013, Judicial Watch released hundreds of pages of FBI documents obtained through a FOIA lawsuit. For the first time, training materials that were deemed offensive by the Bureau's subject matter experts were released. The documents clearly show instances where the subject matter experts make vague claims when identifying materials to be removed, such as the overall tenor of certain presentations is problematic or too informal in the current political context. Judicial Watch also found that the FBI's subject matter experts rejected statements of fact, such as the Muslim Brotherhood's ties to terrorism or Al-Qaeda's connection to past attacks.
Well, it would be as if we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union and telling the FBI and the military not to talk about communism or understand what communism is about or read the writings of Marx. It's just insanity. We're letting foxes run the henhouse.
I mean, think about what's being purged here. A lot of what's being purged is what in the 1990s we called evidence.
Andrew McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor. In 1995, McCarthy led the successful prosecution against 12 individuals, including Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, known as the Blind Sheikh, for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and other planned attacks against New York City landmarks.
In order to get convictions in the terrorism cases in the 1990s, we needed to prove to the jury rationally why these people committed the atrocities they were accused of. So we had to expose them to what the ideology was and show them that the Blind Sheikh was one of the chief exponents of it, and that everything that was done in terms of their conversations and their activities was all laced with the tenets of this ideology. We're now taking that information that we use to convince juries to convict people of terrorism and telling the people that are supposed to be protecting the United States that they don't need to be concerned about that. You can't even wrap your brain around how crazy that is.
I can tell you that a relatively senior FBI agent told me that they were surveilling a terrorist suspect, an Al-Qaeda suspect in the United States, and they had audio-visual surveillance on him, and they could work out that the vector of his movement would take him imminently into a mosque. And he told me that he had to make a split-second decision, because if he told his superiors where that suspect is going, the current conditions would have required him, his manager would have told him, close off the video and audio surveillance because that person's going into a mosque. This is a terrorist suspect. So you're absolutely allowing political requirements to block national security operations. That's the enormity of what we're talking about.
This is ground zero at the Boston bombing. Okay? This is ground zero at the Boston bombing. The Russians gave really good information. But because it didn't meet the ideological screen that the FBI enforces on its own people, they couldn't get their hands around it.
Despite criticism that the FBI missed some warning signs, Mueller said neither incident was preventable. The The 2011 Russian warning about bombing suspect Tamerlan Tsarnaev turned up no terrorist connection.
But you're satisfied with the FBI in the Boston case before the event did a thorough job? Yes.
A 2013 For the Record investigation found that since 2009, the FBI also had evidence detailing radicalization at the Tsarnaev Brothers Mosque, the Islamic Society of Boston, which was founded by convicted terrorist Abdul Rahman Alamoudi.
The FBI never canvassed Boston Mosque until 4 days after the April 15th attacks. If the Russians tell you that someone has been radicalized and you go check and see the mosques that they went to, then you get the articles of incorporation, as I have, for the group that created the Boston Mosque where these Tsarnaevs attended, and you find out the name Alamoudi. Were you aware that those mosques were started by Alamoudi?
I've answered the question, sir.
You didn't answer the question. Were you aware they were started by Alamoudi? You were not? Okay. So the director of the FBI was surprised, obviously, when I said, did you even know who started the Boston Mosque? It was Alamoudi, the guy that's doing 23 years for supporting terrorism. And that's one of the reasons we keep trying to have briefings for other members of Congress, make sure they understand how significant the threat is. I am not somebody that ever looks forward to saying, I told you so. I don't want to ever have to say that. And I'm hoping that enough people will wake up. They didn't before Boston. Boston was preventable.
I wrote a book about my experience in the Blind Sheikh investigation a few years back called Willful Blindness. Back then, we basically closed our eyes to what was obvious. That was reckless. It endangered people to a degree that was irresponsible for government. But it's almost child's play compared to now. Because now we're not just closing our eyes to what's apparent, we're actually going into our files and erasing the knowledge base that we need to protect the country.
The administration says Al-Qaeda is the only problem, and you're allowed to go and hit this Al-Qaeda outpost in this country. It's a very shallow understanding of U.S. national security. Instead of understanding why is there an Al-Qaeda post in that country, who are they connected to, what do they believe, and where are they going to attack next? No, we're not interested in that. The bosses will give you a GPS coordinate, go and give me the head of that Al-Qaeda leader. That's not how you win a war, because this is an ideological war, but you're banned from discussing the ideology.
Welcome back. As we've already noted in this episode, the Obama administration maintains an open dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood. White House logs show dozens of visits from the Brotherhood's American front groups, such as CARE and ISNA, since 2009.
Assalamu alaikum, and congratulations to Imam Magid and everyone at the Islamic Society of North America.
In September 2013, President Obama even gave a personal video address to ISNA for the group's annual convention. Then on January 22, 2014, the president received members of an Iraqi delegation at the White House that included Brotherhood lobbyist Anas al-Tikriti. In the midst of the purge in 2012, the FBI released this report called Guiding Principles on Training. In the publication, the Department of Justice emphasizes the importance of civil liberties, saying that merely associating with organizations that demonstrate violent extremism should not automatically result in a determination that an individual supports that group's violent objectives. In other words, it removes groups with connections to terrorism from suspicion. For more information about tonight's episode, visit our show page at theblaze.com/fortherecord. That's our show for this evening.
So, this is absolutely incredible. We just had this Countering Violent Extremism Summit. It was nothing new. It's a replay of what happened with purging these guidelines back in 2010. and purging the records and changing the guidelines. Okay, so 2010, the DHS changed the guidelines, so we got the foxes guarding the hen house, as he said. And you have this handout in your in the list of handouts. There's a sheet in there with the guidelines on there, the Countering Violent Extremism guidelines. And you'll see in there, if you read the fine print, well not fine print, but some of the print, smaller print, they actually are talking about not to use moderate Muslims as trainers, and moderate being the description ones who are against Sharia. So in other words, it's okay, they're advocating Sharia. I found this on I was looking for something to lighten the load, lighten the mood a little bit, but this is when Janet Napolitano was there. The Tea Parties were starting being investigated, and we were considered extremists, Christians, Catholics, returning vets. That's what all this is coming from, these subject matter experts. Okay, the purge. 2012, hundreds of FBI files, training manuals, and presentations, and they purged all of this in 6 weeks, which, of course, the government does nothing in 6 weeks. All the Patriot-focused trainers were fired. This is that report that Louis Gohmert was giving, the 9/11 Commission report, comparing it to the current lexicon to Congress. And here's all in the last column, all the different times they've mentioned Muslim, Islam, jihad, enemy, etc., and then nothing. By the way, the film talked about how this started to change in 2006. This is definitely a both-party problem. I'll show that as we go through the presentation. It's not just Obama, it's under steroids under Obama, but this is a problem that started way before him and will probably be here after he's gone. Okay, another example, probably one of the worst examples of political correctness is the Fort Hood shooting. Major Nadal Hassan had the business cards with the initials SOA on them. SOA stands for Soldier of Allah. He shouted Allah Akbar as he gunned down 31 Americans, killing 13 of them. He was outraged by our refusal to accept law of Allah, or Sharia, to be the supreme law of the land of the U.S. He had actually given a presentation to higher-ups there a couple of years before this event where he was saying that Muslims should not be in the military because something might go wrong. And that's exactly what he did. So he carried out what he was warning about. I remember not being involved with Act for America, just being a dad yelling at the TV from the couch. And I was watching this, after this all happened, George Stephanopoulos had a program on Sunday morning on ABC, I can't remember the name of it, but he was interviewing General George Casey, and Casey told Stephanopoulos that as bad as the deaths of the 13 soldiers were, it would be an even greater tragedy if our diversity becomes a casualty. This is coming from a general in our army back then. To this day, we consider still classifying this as workplace violence, not as a terrorist attack, even though he's been convicted and sentenced to death. The survivors finally got medals for this, but I'm not quite sure where they stand on their benefits, what's happening there. But still, it's considered workplace violence. U.S. military. So they said they would get involved in our government. They have. They said they'd be involved in the military, and the Muslim Brotherhood instructors have been teaching at the U.S. Naval Academy the last couple of summers. My best friend's son went to the Naval Academy. He's now in San Diego as an ensign in the Navy. And I asked him, I said, so what's going on with Islam at the Academy? He says, well, you know, it's funny you bring that up. He said, the first 2 years I was there, he said, I learned this about Islam. And then he said, the next 2 years, the guys, they come in and said, forget everything you've learned, this is what you need to learn about Islam. So he didn't even know what he learned, but that's what happened to him. The Muslim recruiting station down at, or we call it a recruiting station, at Lackland Air Force Base. Now this is mandatory for every Air Force cadet has to go through this training down at Lackland. Mandatory Muslim sensitivity training.
Oh my word.
Okay. Back in August of 2011, we lost 30 Americans, 17 SEALs and 13 Navy SEAL support. SEAL Team 6, guys that were responsible for taking out Bin Laden, part of them anyway. We're on a mission called Lefty Grove. The chopper's name was Extortion 17. It went down in Afghanistan. These were the guys, so 3 months after bin Laden was taken out, these guys were ambushed in Afghanistan. High-ranking military, parents of the SEAL Team 6 members know that this was a setup. These are some of the stunning things that happened with this. The wrong helicopter was used. They were put on a 1969 Chinook helicopter instead of the special ops helicopter they normally train on. No drones were used as advanced scouts, which never happens. Afghans were switched out at the last second on the manifest. 7 Afghans were switched in the last half hour before this mission took off. Our government went to notify the parents of the 7 Afghans that they thought they were on there to notify them that they died in a crash. Well, they had to go back and apologize to the parents, said, no, we made a mistake. Your sons are alive, and they don't even know who the other 7 Afghans were. The black box from the helicopter is still missing, which they can always find the black boxes. Many of the bodies were cremated without the parents' permission, and the Imam gave the final prayers in Afghanistan and in Arabic, which has been translated by Brigitte, Waleed Shobat, and several other people involved in the fight that we're doing, and they know that our boys were damned to hell. And Jesus was not allowed to be mentioned during the ceremony. We had Billy Vaughn as our guest in Chesterland last October at Word of Grace Church on Mayfield Road. He is one of the dads. This is his son Aaron, this is Billy. You might have seen him on Fox News. His wife Karen is involved with Concerned Vets for America. They've been traveling the country. I brought copies of their book, Betrayed, where Billy wrote it himself so nobody could change anything. And he knows that the Muslim Brotherhood influenced the policy which got these guys set up. It's an excellent book, and we're trying to help them to get a story out. There was a press conference at the National Press Club. You'll see this was the week of May 6th or 7th, something like that, of 2013. And this got lost in the shuffle, never got covered by the media, even Fox. They missed it because they were busy talking about the James Rosen scandal one day, then the AP scandal, then the IRS scandal, then Benghazi. Every day there was a different scandal that week. This press conference that lasted 3 hours at the National Press Club never got picked up. So he's been traveling the country with Act for America chapters, and we had 300 people hear him last October down on Mayfield Road. Okay, CARE, the IRS. CARE received immediate nonprofit IRS status approval after years of improper filing. This happened just before the 2012 elections. They don't even know how to fill out their forms properly. But the person that approved them, stamped them through, was Lois Lerner.
Of course.
Okay, huge problem here. The prisons. Muslim chaplains or imams are certified by the Islamic Society of North America. They are converting many angry prisoners to Islam. The African American communities, they're targets. They're in prison, they've got a chip on their shoulder, they're in there to convert them to Islam and say there's a way they can get back at us. Abdurrahman Al-Amoudi, the guy who was mentioned in the video, and he was also in that video you saw last week, he was the first guy hired or tasked by the Clinton-Gore administration to certify the imams for the prison sentence, or for the prisons system. This is still happening. They're certified by the Islamic Society of North America. This should not be happening. If these people were indicted and shut down, then they wouldn't be hiring all these imams in the federal prisons. Okay, one of the things they talked about in the plan for America was to get a TV station. Lo and behold, we have Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera English, excuse me, owned by the government of Qatar, Al Jazeera, and they are the financial backing of the Muslim Brotherhood. You might have seen this floated around the internet. This happened down in Texas a couple of years with C-Scope, their Texas version of Common Core. This is how blatant it's getting, where we know one of the handouts you have is a homework assignment for one of the grandmother's daughters in Parma, learning the 5 pillars of Islam, whether it be that, as simple as that, or being this, going this way and reciting prayers. I got an email last week about in Medina, kids walking around a cube pretending to be the Kaaba and throwing stones at it. So